From the most trusted names in local news, KDPG Sunday Edition.
Good morning and welcome to the KDPG Sunday Edition. I'm Ken Rice. For just the third time in the last 150 years, we are in the middle of impeachment proceedings against an American president. Democrats accuse President Trump of abusing his presidential authority to benefit himself over the nation. The president calls the process a joke and insists he has done nothing wrong, and many Americans may not know what the truth is. How will this process play out? Are the parties playing fairly? What's this nation's history with presidential impeachment? We are joined today by two experts on the subject, both from Duquesne University. Ken Gormley is Duquesne's president and a renowned scholar on impeachment and the presidency. He's written award-winning books on the impeachment efforts involving Presidents Clinton and Nixon. And Kristen Kupe is the director of pre-law at Duquesne with expertise on U.S. politics and constitutional law. She's taught courses on impeachment. And together, Dr. Kupe and President Gormley team teach a class on the American presidency. No shortage of things to discuss in the Gormley-Kupe class this semester for sure. So I'm delighted to have you both. I don't think there's anyone else in Pittsburgh I'd rather have to talk about this subject, so thank you for being here. It's early in the process, but Democrats control the U.S. House, so Democrats are controlling the impeachment proceeding at this point. Do you believe that they are treating President Trump any differently or any less fairly than Presidents Clinton and Nixon were treated at this point in their impeachment processes? President Gormley, you want to start?
Each impeachment is different. There is no roadmap for an impeachment. We've only had 3 of these proceedings in American history. And so the House of Representatives, the Constitution in Article 1 gives the House broad powers to conduct an impeachment inquiry. And so each of them has been different, but this is not the same as a trial. It's a political process. And so, quite honestly, the House could walk in and vote on articles of impeachment with no process whatsoever. There's no requirement. The only question is, do they get to the point of turning over articles of impeachment to the Senate for a trial? And so actually this process is very thorough. In the Starr Clinton battle during the Clinton presidency, which, as you know, I wrote a book on, actually there was very little process in that because the House just used the Starr report and Ken Starr, the prosecutor, as its key witness, so they weren't bringing in Monica Lewinsky to testify, Paula Jones. So this one actually is as robust as one could expect, but there is no requirement that there be any set formula.
So when the Republicans were complaining mightily about the depositions that were being held privately before we went to this public phase, were they essentially complaining about the same process that was done in the Clinton context, but that was done by the special prosecutor?
Well, actually, some of both, Ken, because I interviewed all the people who were involved. Those House managers and the House impeachment folks like Henry Hyde were also conducting depositions during that process. I remember they had a deposition of Monica Lewinsky beforehand. So there was actually less of that, but to the extent that this process involves bringing in people for depositions before you put them on any kind of a stage, that was done in the Clinton matter.
Okay, so constitutionally, you're okay, you know, with your vast knowledge of constitutional law, you're okay with how things have proceeded to this point, including the behind closed doors depositions?
Dr. Kupe.
I mean, absolutely. The House has the prerogative to set the rules for impeachment. And so if Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic leadership are developing these rules, it's their purview to do this as how they see fit. And up until now, the chief Republican complaint has been that it hasn't been transparent enough. So now what do we have? Transparent, open-door, televised hearings.
Okay, so the Constitution already gives us protection against a would-be tyrant, right? We have presidents who are limited to terms. We have presidents whose powers are unlike a king. They've been separated. There's a legislative, judicial, and executive. So there are already built-in checks. We're coming up. We're 3 years into the Trump term. We're coming up to an election where the public will get a chance to decide if they want Donald Trump to be in office for another 4 years. Republicans have been saying, let the voters decide this president's fate. Why begin an impeachment process this late into the president's term? Does where we are in the president's term invalidate the legitimacy of this process at all, in your opinion?
Not at all. I mean, you have to take the events as they occur. And so the impeachment process is totally different than an electoral process. The question is, and this goes back to the founders when they added the impeachment provision, which dated back to the 1300s in England, that this has to do, it's not a crime, it's different from that. It can be a crime. It has to do with an abuse of public trust. That's what Alexander Hamilton talked about. So there is no timeline on this, and actually it would be, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, it would be irresponsible to not proceed if there were facts dealing with this, because that is very relevant to voters too. So I would say, you could always make that argument. There's always going to be the next election, whether it's that person or a successor. But that certainly, was not the factor in the Clinton case. That thing just went through the entire Clinton presidency, regardless of the fact that there was, there was a Starr investigation before the second election in the Clinton case. So I don't see that as a good argument. I think you let the process play out. They have to make political judgments, though, whether it makes sense to go forward.
Okay, you used the phrase abuse of the public trust. The Constitution talks about treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. So, Dr. Cooper, you've taught courses specifically on impeachment. On day one, do you get into what did the founders mean by high crimes and misdemeanors? Yes,
and it's a very good question that doesn't seem to have a very good answer. That's up to the interpretation of those who are bringing the charges against it. I mean, as President Gormley mentioned, the idea of impeachment dates all the way back to the 1300s. We stole it from the British because they wanted to have some way to hold a king accountable. And so,
but they couldn't impeach a king, right? They could impeach the king's assistants?
Yes.
Okay.
And so if there is some sort of, as President Gormley said, malfeasance, maladministration, a way that these officers of the law are violating the public trust, there has to be some mechanism for removal, whether it's on day one or the day before their term ends.
And Ken, if I could just clarify one thing that I haven't seen discussed much in the commentary. If you look back at the history of that phrase, first of all, treason, bribery, and high crimes and misdemeanors, but there was actually in Old English law a meaning to a high misdemeanor. That was separate than a high crime. And that was something that was not necessarily a crime, but was endangered the well-being of the state. So that specifically deals with something that threatens the well-being of the state rather than necessarily something that is a crime.
Okay, but you could have one interpretation of what high crimes and misdemeanors are. You can have another, I can have a third, but really all that matters is what the House decides it means,
sure,
right?
absolutely. Gerald Ford famously, when he was in Congress, said, an impeachable offense is whatever a majority of Congress decides in any moment of history, and that is the correct answer.
Okay, so Americans are trying to decide, is what the president is alleged to have done here an impeachable offense? And Democrats will tell you, yes, he took advantage of his presidential authority to benefit himself personally and politically at the expense of the nation's interest. But what exactly did he do that may be impeachable? And is it easy for you to explain? If so, how would you explain, Dr. Kupi, what the president is accused of doing? How would you explain that to your students or to a friend or your mom, anybody?
What you need to do is sell a story. And this is what the Democrats are having a very difficult time with, because this is just so chaotic. There's so many players. We went from the Mueller report and Russian interference to Ukraine, and now this is the new hot topic that, as Republicans have said, you're just trying to find some reason to get him out of office. But the whistleblower, these top diplomats, these civil servants that are coming in and testifying are painting a picture that President Trump has used the power of his office to disparage political opponents and to benefit himself in the next election. And that is what the House needs to decide, if that is some sort of impeachable offense.
And let me say this, Ken. Let's take the partisan piece of this out of it. Let's say this isn't in the midst of the Trump presidency, and we were just to sit down with folks, whether it's a public forum or in Congress, and say, is it okay for a president to use his or her office to withhold funds that Congress has approved? So you don't get to not give those out unless you request that from Congress, which wasn't done, in order to put pressure on another foreign government to give you information to benefit you politically. Now, those are the allegations. That would have to be proven. If that's the case, I think most people would say, no, you can't do that. That is the essence of what is here, because that could be viewed as subverting the government's foreign policy if that was the case. Let me say that ultimately, I do think that it is going to have to be a judgment whether or not that is extreme enough to remove someone from office. But it does fall into that zone, I believe, of what the framers had in mind if proven.
Do you both expect the House will go ahead with articles of impeachment and then voting to send this to the Senate for trial?
I think so.
Do you have any doubt that they would have gone this far without knowing
I do.
that was the end game?
Yeah, sure. This, as someone said in the Clinton ordeal, it's barroom rules. Anything could happen at any moment. So you could get new information that shifts the dialogue, but there are always a couple of backups here, Ken, that people don't think about. Congress could just decide to pass legislation and say, never more. This is prohibited, and if it happens again, it's a crime. That is one reason that Congress should be looking into issues like this, regardless of whether they impeach. But secondly, if you remember during the Clinton episode, there was an effort to get an agreement on a censure of President Clinton. I talked to President Ford, who was part of that, along with Jimmy Carter, and he believed that that would have been for the good of the country to get. He tried to get Bill Clinton to agree to it, and President Clinton wouldn't agree to it. But there's nothing.
Are you talking Clinton or Nixon?
Clinton.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
President Ford, the former President Ford, was trying to broker a deal with Jimmy Carter.
Okay.
And so there are different ways. There's nothing in the Constitution that allows for censure, but there's nothing that says you can't. As you know, Andrew Jackson was censured. So things can change. I am not convinced right now there will be a vote on impeachment.
You're not?
I'm not.
If it goes to the Senate, can either of you imagine right now enough Republicans voting against the president? You need a 2/3 vote to remove him. Can you imagine right now the proceedings in the House changing enough minds? Again, all we know is according to polling, but changing enough minds to have the president removed?
No.
Can you imagine that right now?
Yes,
Because we don't know what's going to come out.
exactly, the barroom rules. I mean, in the Nixon case,
The smoke, there
there was, until the smoking gun tape was released, the Republican supporters of Nixon were as firm as the Republicans are right now. When that happened, there was a seismic shift, and it led people to say, I just can't do it anymore. I don't know I doubt that will happen here, but you're in a perilous terrain. Both parties are facing peril in this exercise.
Okay, we're going to take a break, come back and talk about what would happen. We've never been there before. What would happen if the Senate were to vote to convict President Trump? How would he be removed from office? Where would the nation go from there? That and more when the KDPG Sunday edition continues in just a moment.